So we've missed a few lessons on the unseen poetry, and I thought I'd create you a little video just to give you something to revise from. Now this is for part 1 of section C on English Literature paper 2. So the unseen section is section C, and it has 2 parts. Part 1 is the larger part of the question, it's 24 marks, and you just have to focus on the one poem, so that's what I'm going to focus on now. Now the key thing to remember is that nobody is expecting you to actually fully understand this poem. This is an unseen poem, it is not a poem that you've been taught, so nobody's expecting you to fully understand it. All you need to do is show the examiner that you've got the skills to analyse a poem on your own. They're testing to see if you can do this without your teacher telling you the answers. So that's all you've got to do. Now the first thing I suggest you do with this is spend a good 5 to 10 minutes reading the poem and figuring out what the poem's about. And do annotate the poem whilst you're doing that. If you don't spend a lot of time really reading the poem and unpicking it, then you won't get the gist of what the poem's about. And if you haven't got the general gist of it, a general feel of it, you won't then be able to zoom in and analyse any quotations and any language used. So when you get to section C, the first thing you should do is read the poem through twice. That's important because you're not going to get everything the first time you read it, because lots of the meaning will be unravelled throughout the course of the poem, so the movement from beginning to end, and often only upon second reading of a text do you really understand it. You know, just take Jekyll and Hyde as an example of that. You only really fully understand it the second time you read it through. So read the poem through twice first of all, and see if you can identify any techniques or anything that stands out to you or that appears striking when you're reading it. Once you've done that, then spend some time annotating the poem. So the things you want to look at are the title. The title often gives you an insight into what the poem's about. So in this poem the title is Meantime. Might be a play on the idea of Greenwich Mean Time. Perhaps a play on the word mean, a kind of pun there in terms of the cruelty of time. The titles of poems quite often give us an insight into what the poem's about, so they shouldn't be ignored. Then have a look at how the poem begins and ends. There'll often be something structural going on with the first lines and the closing lines of the poem. So here we've got the theme of time straight away at the beginning of this poem. The clocks slid back an hour. So this idea of time going back. We might refer to daylight savings and Greenwich Mean Time, but here obviously there's an idea of heartbreak and losing that time that you've invested in somebody else. If we go to the end of the poem, these are the shortened days and the endless nights. We've got again this continuing idea of winter, but time and winter being used really in a metaphorical way in this poem to represent the end of the relationship. So think about how the beginning and end of the poem link together and see if there's anything interesting you can say about that. And then have a look for other patterns in the poem. Patterns are really important in the unseen because they help you to understand the threads, the things that connect the poem together, and the key ideas and themes in the poem. So any semantic fields or motifs or repeated words that you can find will help you to unpick what the poem is talking about. Once you've done that, you can of course look for things like similes and metaphors, alliteration, but be very careful of identifying things like alliteration and sibilants. This is not a test in what you can identify in the poem. Oh, here we go, look, that's alliteration. Right, so what? You have to really explain to the examiner why the poet has done that and what they're trying to achieve by doing that. Remember that poetry is an art form, it's something which has been deliberately crafted for a certain effect. And if you can't explain what that effect is, there's absolutely no point in picking out the alliteration. It's an absolute waste of time and ink. So once you've kind of figured out the gist of the poem and you've identified some techniques, then you can think about how you're going to group that together into some points. Now my advice to you would be, for the unseen poem, you should write a couple of lines as a very brief introduction, and then you should write maybe 3 analytical points about the poem. So a brief introduction to the poem is really going to just give us the outline of what the poem is about. look at the question. The question will give you an insight to the poem. So a question for this particular poem might be, how does the poet present feelings after a breakup? Then you know, okay, right, this is a poem about a breakup. I can understand now why we're talking about time. So just in your introduction, literally 2 sentences, a couple of lines, just outline the gist of the poem. What in a general sense is this poem about? What is the big picture? What's the poem saying? What's the poet's intentions? What's the key ideas in this poem? What you're doing then is you're saying to the examiner, I understand the general meaning of this poem, and now I'm going to move on from there. Now I've established that. And that's all you need to do. So then you're going to write 3 analytical paragraphs about the unseen poem. Each analytical paragraph should start with some kind of topic sentence which outlines what the paragraph is going to be about, and then some close analysis of the language and structure of the poem. Now, this whole question is about analysis, so your sole focus should be on really close, insightful analysis of the poem. Now, when I use that word insightful, this is another time where I'm going to refer to alliteration. Often when we talk about alliteration, there's nothing very insightful we can say about it. There's nothing really we can say other than this creates emphasis. But emphasising what? So really make sure that you are judicious, that you're careful in the quotes that you pick and the techniques that you pick to write about. If you pick a weak technique or a weak quotation, you will not be able to write good quality analysis. So you really have to spend quite a lot of your time picking out the good quality things to write about, the things that are actually going to give an insight into what's going on in this poem. So pick out some 3 points that you might want to write about, and I've got some sentence starters for you here that might be useful. Okay, so you can see here that we can talk about structure in those first sentence examples, the way the poem begins, the way it ends, how that might progress over the course of the poem, the idea of tone, the emotion that comes across in the poem. Semantic fields or patterns in the poem can also count as kind of structural points about how the whole poem is put together. Then in that middle section, I've put some evaluative phrasing. We do want to try and use evaluative phrasing because it shows that we're giving an insight into the text. We're actually really analysing it carefully. So we need to think about how this poem speaks to us, having a personal response to the poem, but also quite a formal response. So the thing which resonates the most, the thing which has the most impact, perhaps the most emotive element. These are all good ways of giving a personal response, but in a formal and evaluative way. And then in the bottom one, we've got some ideas about the poet's intentions and what message they might be trying to convey to us. Now remember that nobody's expecting you to actually know what the poet's intentions are. This is just about you actually having the confidence to suggest what the poet's intentions are. So again, I can't emphasise enough how the unseen is really not at all about you fully getting the poem, and don't worry at all about what other people say about the poem when they come out of the exam either, because it's not about that. What we're looking for is the confidence that you have to identify what's going on in the poem, zoom in on really precise specific details of the language, the lexis, the connotations of words, and have the confidence to suggest or kind of ponder on what the poet's intentions might be and what they might be trying to achieve with this poem. It's all about confidence. All of the elements of analysis that you would normally do in any kind of literature assessment all apply here, but you've got to just be confident to go with your gut feeling and include all of those elements of depth of analysis. So a short introduction, a couple of lines, 3 analytical points, no need for a conclusion. It's 24 marks, and in total you should spend about half an hour on this question.